Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello everyone, and welcome to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I am your host, Joanna. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bouncing Back. I am your host, Joanna, and today we are going to be chatting about one of my favorite topics, which is relationships, but specifically the concept of childhood trauma and the power it has to impact our interpersonal relationships. So joining me today is our guest, Claire Hurtwitz. Claire is a psychologist and the owner of Claire Hurtwitz Psychology. She works towards creating a safe space to enable people to start a journey of self-discovery, self-growth, healing and change using holistic, evidence-based approaches. Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
And we're so happy to have you here with us. Now, before we get started and dive into everything, I'd love if you could just tell us a bit more about who you are and what it is you do.
So I'm a clinical psychologist. I practice in Sydney. I have my own practice, and I really, I'm really passionate about relationships and social psychology and human connection. And I always just knew I loved psychology and helping people. I think from a very young age, my mom used to tell me that I was the one taking the little kids to a nurse at school if they fell. And I didn't really know what else I wanted to do. So I just took the risk and went with this, and it worked out well.
That's beautiful. I love stories like that, and it really sounds like you found your calling. So that's amazing. So I'd love to jump into a section we call Have You Met Claire? So here we just have a few get to know you questions. So my first one for you is, what is your favorite book?
So I would say a fiction book is Verity by Colleen Hoover. I'm not sure if you have read it or heard about it.
I've definitely read it, yeah.
Yes. So psychological thriller. It just really left me wanting to read it more and more and more. And I think it's a good book when you end up shedding a few tears at the end. I felt really connected to the characters. And I hadn't read a fiction book in a while. So I think when I got into this, it really stood out. So that was a fiction book. And a non-fiction, of course, I have to bring my psych, passion here. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it really just explores how the body holds trauma and new age methods to work with trauma. So it really provides quite a modern new age way of looking at trauma and healing trauma.
Yeah, and both really great picks. I love Verity. I remember I read it on like a long haul flight and I was so invested the entire time. I did not put that book down. It's such a great plot and it really just keeps you on the edge of your seat, which I love.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, amazing. Well, next question here is, what is a movie that you have enjoyed recently?
I recently saw Anyone But You. It's a rom-com, but I just loved it. I haven't seen a rom-com in a long time. And it was the first time I'd been to the cinemas in a long time. And I just loved the whole movie. Fun, like light, set in Australia. Also relational themes coming up. So obviously that was up my alley. And yeah, just something that made you feel good. And I like the message at the end of the movie.
Yeah, I definitely think that it was a really fun, lighthearted movie and a lot of people did enjoy it. So I'm glad to hear that you did as well.
Yeah, sure.
Great. And moving on, are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
Yeah, I am. I'm listening to a few. My favorites at the moment are The School of Greatness by Lewis Howes, and that really just covers a range of topics, influential people, whether it be business, health, relationships, psychology, self-growth. So I really just love hearing the wisdom shared by these different people on the podcast. And the second podcast is The Imperfects. And this podcast really just normalizes imperfection, which I think is so needed in our day and age where there's so much strive to be perfect. So it really kind of just allows you to relate to the average person and gives you insight into people who you might perceive as the perfect individual actually having their own challenges.
Yeah, and I think that second one sounds really interesting. I love listening to podcasts that really challenge sort of what I already know and that allow me to learn about new things and even things that I've never heard about before. So thank you so much. I love those recommendations.
You're welcome.
Great. And I've got one last question here for you, and that is, do you have a role model?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I know it's a common one, but I'd say Oprah is my role model. I remember watching her shows all the way back in South Africa when I was probably 7 years old. And I really think she is a woman who shows that trauma doesn't have to define you and how much, you can grow and thrive and become wiser and stronger through adversity. And that, does speak to what we will get to later on, but about resilience. But she's just someone I think has, done amazingly well, amazing things worldwide, and has this real strength that's admirable.
Yeah, definitely. And I can 100% agree. And even though she might be a common role model, that just shows like the power of what the work she does and the messages she sends out there. They're really impactful. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Let's dive into our interview questions. So my first one for you is, why do you think resilience is important in our lives?
So, people face all kinds of adversity in life, whether it's, a personal loss, a loss of a loved one, whether it's a personal crisis, such as a relationship breakdown. Challenging life events are unavoidable and inevitable and out of our control. And resilience is really the ability to withstand adversity and adapt and bounce back from these experiences. It's a set of skills that can be learned and grow over time. It's not a fixed trait. And I think that's something that provides a lot of hope for people who do go through adversity and challenges, that there is capacity to develop resilience.
Yeah, and that's the thing, I guess, because when we are in a really bad place in our lives, we think that we're going to be stuck there forever and that there's no way out of this. And something that I like to think is that when you're at your lowest, there's only one way you can go, which is up. And that is a form of resilience as well. Even just that hope and having that hope that things can get better and they will get better.
Yeah, I really like that. There's only one way, it's going up. And yeah, that's a good message.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to dive more into, childhood trauma and how this is going to link to what we're talking about today. So firstly, I'd love if we could just unpack what childhood trauma is and what it could look like.
Yeah, so childhood trauma is the experience of an event by a child that is emotionally painful, distressful, and that leads to lasting mental and physical effects. It's usually trauma that occurs between birth and age 6. Children are particularly, going through huge brain development in their first 3 years of life. And they also dependent on their primary caregiver for nurture, safety, protection. So children are particularly vulnerable to trauma at this stage. And if the trauma, involves a primary caregiver, it can be really, really impactful later on in life. So childhood trauma can occur when a child witnesses or experiences overwhelming negative events in childhood. So this could look like a person or people doing something which harms a child. So that could be sexual, physical, emotional abuse, could be trafficking. There could be witnessing violence at home, bullying, which might take place online or in person. It could even be witnessing or experiencing violence in the community, such as war, children who are refugees or asylum seekers. Trauma in childhood can also look like a child experiencing trauma because their parent or caregiver is affected by their own trauma. And this really impacts the child because it means that the parent can't attend to the child's physical and emotional needs. So examples of this might be a parent or a caregiver who has their own chronic mental or physical illness or condition. It could be a serious injury or accident, substance use, maybe that there's divorce, separation, or even, imprisonment. And lastly, trauma in childhood can also look like a child who's not well cared for. So emotional neglect, for instance, which is common in situations of poverty or discrimination.
Yeah, and there's a lot of factors there. And what's really interesting to me is like when you have conversations with people about relationships, and for example, a relationship breaks down, they'll ask you, oh, so does this person have any childhood trauma? Maybe that could be why this happened in the relationship or why, it went down the way it did. Do you think that everyone has childhood trauma?
Yeah, I think trauma it's become a bit of a buzzword and
Yeah.
I really believe trauma is all relative. So when we start comparing traumas, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the conversation, but big T traumas, which is more of the life-threatening events. And then there's the little t, which are perhaps what we see as more mundane, but they still traumatic. And what I mean by that is, a parent telling a child, like, stop crying. It's like, that was silly. Just come on, get over it. It sounds quite, maybe for some nonchalant, like the parents just being, strict or just setting some limits. But what messages the child takes from that dismissal of their emotions is, very, very different and can be really impactful. So I can't say for certainty that everyone experiences trauma, but I would imagine that everyone has gone through experiences in their life where their core emotional needs have not been met in the way they've needed to at points in time. And that's left some impact.
Yeah. And do people often know where that is? Like, can they think back and be like, oh, this happened in my childhood, so it makes sense why I'm this way today? Or is it sometimes just really like hidden or buried and you can't really pinpoint where that happened?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually see, a lot of clients who really haven't joined the dots and actually say, like, I don't know why I'm like this. Like, I had a really good upbringing, supportive parents, like, went on holidays, like all the really externally great stuff that are really great. But then when you start to actually unpack and look at what was not done, we can look at, what was done and then you put that on paper and that looks great. But sometimes when I then ask the question of, did you have, conversations around the family table? Were you asked, how was your day? Or questions that that really come to more of the emotional needs that a child has, they'll often say, no, like, I don't actually remember that. Or, yeah, like emotions weren't spoken about in my family. So then once they understand what these emotional needs are, they really start to link perhaps why they behave in certain ways that they do in adulthood.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And I guess those things only arise when you start having the conversations, or when you book in a session with a psychologist and you're like, I want to figure out why this is happening or why I'm this way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to ask if people feel like there is something that can't be explained by their actions or their behavior, or they're wondering, like, why am I this way? How can they go about seeking help? Do you just go straight to a psychologist? How can they approach these types of thoughts?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways to actually get in touch with a psychologist. So, of course, you can just go onto the internet and you can contact, you can research. There's the Australian Psychological Society. So if you're in Australia, that is, there's a search directory for therapists based on location. So you've got that as a resource. You can go on websites such as Psychology Today, which again is based in Australia, but it gives you all the therapists who have put themselves on that. Often what one does, and I'm speaking for at least in Australia, they go to their GP and they will speak to the GP about their concerns, and the GP will typically refer them to a psychologist. And if you are in Australia, you get, and you're covered with Medicare, if you're a citizen, you get 10 sessions covered by Medicare. So 10 sessions a year, and they rebate it. So you out of pocket, about half of what you would be if you weren't rebated. So that's the psychological side of things. And, depending on the extent of trauma and the symptoms that someone is displaying, medication is also, commonly used. And I would say this is more for post-traumatic stress disorder, when there's significant anxiety or panic or depression. And to get that medication, typically I would refer to a psychiatrist, and you get that referral from a GP as well.
Great. And I love how Australia has a process for that, and how, there are, resources, and you can go to your GP and you can get those 10 sessions if you are covered by Medicare, for example. But for those of us who might not be ready to see a psychologist or seek out professional help, is there something that they can just start out with?
Yeah. So I would probably say doing some reading, like educating oneself on what trauma is. There's lots of platforms online, even just on Instagram. There's lots of accounts of psychologists who are talking about trauma in very relatable, simple ways. There's lots of, practices learned. I won't recommend specific practices more generally, because it can be trauma dependent. Some practices might be really good for targeting certain traumas, but not work for other traumas. But what I would say is having a GP as a first point of call, to just speak to your GP, having, I'd say, a person there, a supportive person who you feel safe with, whether it's a GP, whether it's, a friend, a family member. If that's not accessible to you, then I would say calling, a contact line like Lifeline, and just calling a free, service to speak through it. I will say that there's so many resources out there and so much information that one can really go down a bit of a deep dive on the internet, and you might come across information that's actually more confusing. or might exacerbate symptoms. So depending on what one is going through, I would recommend certain things over and above others. But first and foremost, when we are in a trauma state or having difficulties with relationships, or I really, come back to humans needing safety and connection. And how can we find that connection?
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that and the different approaches we might take. I'd love to get back into, talking about childhood trauma and how it impacts us. So people, like we mentioned, aren't often aware that they have childhood trauma. So how might this impact their interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one significant impact of childhood trauma is on our attachment system and our attachment styles. John Bowlby's attachment theory, which is a renowned theory, really emphasizes that the bond with an innate primary caregiver is essential for our development. So one's bond with their primary caregiver during childhood has a significant influence on how we see ourselves, the world, and other people. And we tend to mirror our relationships in adulthood based on those that we experience with our primary caregiver. And we develop an attachment style in response to the emotional quality of the relationship with our primary caregiver. So the way that childhood trauma can show up by attachment styles is, well, there's 4 attachment styles. So you have the secure attachment style, which is the most common type. People with the secure type are generally comfortable expressing emotions. They, have, a secure level of trust, can communicate effectively. The anxious attachment style, people with this style have a deep fear of abandonment. So they tend to have a negative self-view. There's a common belief that they are unworthy of love and they need a lot of reassurance in a relationship to feel worthy. There's the avoidant attachment style, and one with an avoidant attachment tend to not depend on others. They quite uncomfortable with emotions, can be quite fearful of commitment, a high level of independency. And then you have the disorganized, which is a mix of anxious and avoidant. And this is primarily evident with those who've experienced complex trauma, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. This person moves between anxious and avoidant, which can be very confusing for a partner who is perhaps secure or just anxious, that push and pull. And I'll just give you an example. So someone with an anxious attachment style who might get into a relationship with an avoidant person creates a significant challenge. So the anxious partner will typically need lots of reassurance and security, and the avoidant person will typically feel quite smothered by their emotional needs, which then leaves the anxious person questioning whether they're lovable, whether they're worthy enough. And the anxious person becomes hypervigilant to any signal that might prove that their avoidant partner doesn't like them, doesn't desire them. And it ends up being a cycle. So attachment style is a really key part that has a big role in our adult relationships.
Yeah. And how can, we understand childhood trauma in the way that it impacts resilience?
So childhood trauma really impacts resilience in the sense that relationships that are safe and stable and nurturing are foundational for the development of resilience. So when a child experiences trauma, it can often result in the child developing an unreliable and untrustworthy representation of their caregivers, which affects one's capacity to develop deeper, loving relationships. Childhood trauma can impact on the child's emotional development, being able to identify emotions, regulate emotions, describe emotions, all of which are really important for resilience. As well as that, the developing brain of a child is significantly vulnerable to toxic stress, which is caused by adverse events in childhood. So toxic stress is the body's response to long-term serious stress without enough support from the caregiver. So when a child's needs are not met, such as nurturance, security, reassurance, their body cannot turn off the stress response. So your body will naturally be in a more overactive state. So your body might actually think, it's in front of a lion when you actually just at home sitting on the couch, just being triggered by something. And when we're in a sympathetic, overactive state, it's really difficult to think clearly, focus. Things become unclear, and it has detrimental effects to then how you show up and relate to people.
Yeah. And in terms of relating to people and how we show up, how does our childhood trauma potentially impact our communication patterns in our relationships?
Yeah. So childhood trauma can really impact one's emotional regulation. So typically one with a history of trauma can be more emotionally dysregulated, be really overreactive. Again, your nervous system is overactive, so it doesn't take much to kind of set you off. There can be outbursts, or there can be shutdowns. So the shutdowns might look like defensiveness, criticism, stonewalling, so just ignoring. It can really affect the relationship one has with vulnerability. So vulnerability is basically the conscious intention to be open with your fears, with, the raw hidden parts of oneself without caring as much what others think. But when we've been through trauma, vulnerability is really, really difficult because there's such a fear that the world's a dangerous place. People might be inconsistent. People might leave us. And what we know is that vulnerability is so important for connection. Vulnerability fosters connection. So it becomes a bit of a catch because to develop deeper relationships, and to connect more, we need to be vulnerable. But it's very hard for one with trauma or trauma history to be vulnerable. So, and of course, there's many ways we work with that in therapy, and you can make groundbreaking, results with that. But that is one key way that it can show up as well.
Yeah. And, sorry, go ahead.
Just one more. Yeah. One other thing that comes to mind is those, who have had trauma, again, depending on the severity, can end up feeling quite emotionally numb. So this, can really impact the emotional availability in the relationship. And it can mean that they have difficulty verbalizing their needs and their feelings. It leads to a lot of, perhaps confusion for the other partner. And it just, I suppose, exacerbates what already might be there in the relationship. So yeah, there's quite a few, and I could dive deeper into this, but I know that we've only got a certain amount of time. But communication is one huge area that significantly is impacted by childhood trauma.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is, in the case where someone isn't aware that their childhood trauma is impacting their relationship, how long does it usually take for them to realize that there could be an underlying issue for the way that they are? For example, they have a more challenging attachment style, like they're an avoidant, for example. How long does it take, or what does it take for them to finally come to terms with it or be like, wow, okay, I need to address this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there's a few moving pieces to that. First and foremost, so awareness is the number one step to the process of, working on things and healing. So whether your partner's making you aware of that, whether you start to notice yourself that things don't seem right, actually having that insight and awareness to then perhaps go to a psychologist or further explore. And then with that therapeutic process, let's say if you did decide to go down the therapy path, when one, is showing that intentional commitment and actually kind of taking action in between the therapy sessions, because that's really where a lot of the change happens, it can take, I would say working on trauma, I always say, at least, I'd say it's medium to long-term therapy. So minimum 6 months, but typically a year or longer. But when one recognizes what their underlying beliefs are, what their, behaviors are that lead to more difficult experiences, and you map that out, you can really start to see change by taking action and, really just even being mindful of your triggers, how you react, what are more, healthier alternative ways of responding. And it can be quite a flowy and progressive, path.
Yeah. And would you say that in terms of this kind of change and making this change, that people don't change unless they want to change? So this kind of desire to be better or change patterns or past behaviors has to come from like within, and a realization from yourself that something needs to change.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer in that. I think fundamentally, if we don't see something and believe it and see the value of changing something, then it's very difficult to actually change something. And, I think it really does start with oneself. And, when it comes to change and, when it comes to therapeutic change, we can be told to go see a psychologist, and let's say a partner tells their partner to go see a psychologist, and they might go see the psychologist, but if they're not really wanting to be there, or if they don't see the value in that, I think, and it really comes down to value being a key part of whether one changes on, or how much one changes. I do think that really has impact on the success of the change.
Yeah. And what do you think makes people want to change or address something like childhood trauma?
I think when we're in a relationship, let's say we're in a romantic relationship and you really value and have love for that person, just knowing the impact that one's own, traumas or difficulties are having on the relationship and on the other person, I think can be a big part of enabling one and leading that person to change and seek help. If you actually value that connection and see, what that is adding to your life. So I think in a relationship dynamic, just caring for that person and not wanting to lose them and wanting to have a happier, more peaceful, satisfying life. And I suppose just for oneself, seeing the impact it has on areas of your life. And I suppose weighing up how, out of a week or just in a day, how often am I feeling good versus not good? And when you start to actually take note of that and the not great feelings are outweighing feeling good, I think that can be a real wake-up call, because at the end of the day, we have one life. And when you see how fast, I at least feel that the years just fly and fly as I get older, and having all these, I suppose, examples and influential people talking about the value of life, I think that really does give people a push as well to take action and try and make change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that really links to breaking cycles and not letting things happen over and over again without anything being done about them. So, how can the cycle of trauma be broken or challenged so that we can, work towards more resilient and more positive relationships?
Yeah, I really think that when one has experienced trauma, adversity, we tend to treat ourselves rather unkindly. We can tend to criticize ourselves. What's the matter with me? We can feel shame, we can feel worthless. And self-compassion is one key way that we can really try and break the cycle of trauma and just the challenging, ripple effect that happens from trauma. Self-compassion really involves treating yourself with kindness, care, and support, just like you would with a friend. We often would say things to a friend that we would never even consider saying to ourselves firsthand, and and something like compassion where we can be mindful, which is bring ourselves back to the present moment, being non-judgmental, also understanding that difficulties and adversities and challenges are, a common human experience. And knowing that one's not alone in that, I think is very, very important to break the cycle of trauma, to know that it's not just you alone in this world going through this. There's, it's a common humanity type experience.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked about like romantic relationships a bit, and childhood trauma obviously, relates to a family environment most of the time and comes from like your childhood. So what are some strategies people can use to sort of foster more positive experiences within their family environment without letting their childhood trauma impact that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I would say first and foremost, educating yourself about children, from their brain to their body, really just understanding how children, I suppose I wouldn't say work, but what makes up the child, the needs, the physical, the emotional needs. I would say, reflecting emotions back to children. So this really helps a child build self-worth, empathy, positive communication skills. Soothing them when they are distressed teaches them over time how to soothe themselves. As a child gets older, and they're able to express themselves, listening and learning to validate their experiences. So, for example, saying, I'm so glad you're telling me this. Thank you for sharing this. And what this is really telling the child is that this feeling that you're feeling is real. And even though you're feeling it, I still want to be in a relationship with you. And this child then essentially learns that if my parent can tolerate this in me, that means I can maybe tolerate this in me. And then that actually means that someone else later in life could tolerate this in me.
Yeah, so that like ripple effect of feeling validated and feeling appreciated and being compassionate towards yourself can have positive impacts on, future interpersonal relationships that you might have as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, another key kind of strategy that I would really suggest is and highlight is making discipline about actions rather than about the child. So whilst the child needs rules and consequences, I think we often see that consequences is tied to personal qualities about the child rather than the actions. So what ends up happening is that the child starts to believe that they are failure or they're incompetent in something or inadequate, when actually when we tie it to the action, it becomes much less personal and the child doesn't internalize this big experience as there is something wrong with me.
Yeah. And thank you so much for sharing that and also emphasizing that as well, that dealing with childhood trauma doesn't just have to be in the future when it's already happened, but it's something that can be prevented or something that can be shaped in a different way while someone is still a child and they're going through that, phase of growing up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask if you had, a key message or piece of advice you would like people to be left with regarding overcoming childhood trauma and building resilience in relationships.
Yeah, I really believe that connecting with trauma on an emotional level is really, really imperative. And I would say, befriending our body. And as Stephen Porges says, who is a pioneer in the field of neuroscience, we have an essential need for safety hardwired into our minds and our body. And our nervous system is really the foundation for our lived experience. So we often think that the brain is running the show, and that, is really highlighted by, a lot of us intellectualizing, being so cognitive. But actually, our body holds the trauma. Our body holds all the emotions. And I really believe that until we actually connect with what is going on in our body, it can be very difficult to truly resolve the trauma, because it's something that we need to feel through as opposed to talk the feelings through.
Yeah.
And I would say that regulating your nervous system is a practice that I encourage my clients to do. I even try and practice that as much as I can, but like everyone else, there are times when I forget about it or I haven't done it enough and I feel a bit dysregulated. But practicing regulating your nervous system by the most simplest thing that we have accessible to us, which is just through our breath. I say that is the first and foremost simplest way that we can come back to ourselves, which is focusing on just slowing down our breathing, grounding our feet literally on the ground, even just looking around and noticing what is in your environment, actually looking at 5 things you can see, 4 things you can, hear, doing something that just brings you to the present moment, and ultimately learning how to be with your body and start tolerating your body, because we too often try run away from our body because we're so scared of being with it and being vulnerable and what that might lead to. And 99.9% of the time, that fear is more of a, irrational type fear than actually what would happen in the moment. And I'm not saying that it's easy to just sit with the discomfort, by no means, but the fear that we have around something bad might happen and we might become, uncontrollable if we do sit with the discomfort, is what I try target with that, which is that 99.9% of the time we don't crumble. It might be really sad and difficult, but we're still able to pick ourselves back up after an amount of time and continue on.
Yeah. And I guess you might say that it's a matter of when, not if, someone bounces back.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's such a message of hope that, that is not the end when something bad happens, and that you can pick yourself up, and that, better times are ahead. And it is hard when you're in the moment and you can't really see that happening, or you can't really envision a version of yourself that is out of, the situation you're in, and you think this is going to be a constant. But I think a part of resilience is being able to sort of see that within yourself and know that you will get to that point.
Absolutely. And actually a quote that really nicely highlights this by Judith Lewis Herman. She's an American psychiatrist who is in the area of traumatic stress, says that the pain of trauma can be the catalyst for personal growth, leading us to discover inner strength and resilience we never knew we possessed.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful, I think, very true quote.
Yeah, and I definitely think that it's our hardships and the moments of change that force us to become better people, because you can either choose to sit there in that really sad, horrible situation that you're in and just stay in that and accept that as your reality and your future, or you can choose to rebuild and build from there. And, like I started off by saying, there's only one way to go when you're at your lowest or you're at rock bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really resonate with that.
Great. Well, I'd love to jump into our practices and habits here and kind of just dive into a practice that people might be able to use, or like a strategy. So is there a practice that you recommend to deal with childhood trauma? I know we've talked about a few things that can be done, but is there something you would specifically recommend?
Yeah, so I would say, a trauma-informed mindfulness practice. And why I say trauma-informed as opposed to general mindfulness is because some parts of just general mindfulness might not be appropriate depending on the type of trauma. So trauma-informed is really important, especially because when we're dealing with the body and depending on the type of trauma, it can actually exacerbate the symptoms and the stress rather than improve them. So one practice that I really like it's called the 5 senses. And you really just start by taking a few deep breaths, and essentially you're counting down from 5, but it's a grounding mindfulness-based practice where you are connecting with your senses. So you look wherever you are. You might be in a room, you might be at home in your bedroom. You are starting with 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. Now, you can do it in any order. It's just much easier to think of 5 things that you can see as opposed to 5 things you might taste if you're just sitting in your bed. But you're just counting down, and what that is doing, and why this practice is so good is that it decreases the intensity of a person's feelings or trauma by distracting them using the 5 senses. And you're immediately connecting with the present moment, which is going to make it much more difficult to stay in that distress or spiral or whatever else was happening before. It can really take you from negative thoughts, and take you away from those negative thoughts, which tend to exacerbate the distress. And this practice can be done at any time. You could do it when you're out in public, in the privacy of your own home. It's something that no one would ever know that you're doing if you were doing it in public.
Yeah. And what are some of the challenges that might come with this practice?
Yeah. So whilst it's very difficult to be consumed with difficult emotion, it's very difficult, to do something when we are consumed with difficult emotions, and perhaps one's focus might not fully be there. And if that is the case, I would say bring yourself back to a few deep breaths, really just trying to ground yourself with breathing and actually trying to feel a bit more, calmness in your body before coming back to the senses. And if one is consumed with perhaps negative thoughts, noticing that as actually something you're noticing and trying to move back to, okay, I can see this picture. I can feel my fingers. It's not about doing that perfectly. It's really, this is just about trying as best you can to get some distance from the emotional distress. So we're kind of trying to intercept it. And even if, and I say this to my clients all the time, even if there's 5% improvement, that's still a positive outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I love that, because no matter how much you've improved, you've still improved, even if it's just a little bit. And in terms of like the logistics with this practice, is there a certain time people should do this? Should they be, like you said, you don't have to be in a certain place. So do they need to prepare for this in any way?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's no right amount of times. I would say you practice this when you are noticing your mind's racing with negative thoughts, or you're feeling really difficult emotional, pain, distress, overwhelm, anxiety. That's just an opportunity to, come back to the present. For instance, using this strategy, it could be, in the morning, at night, midday. You could do it 3 times a day if you wanted to, but there's no set structure or time or recommendation in that way. But I would say to actually get familiar with the practice, perhaps doing it, daily, just to become familiar with bringing yourself back to the present moment, because that's something that we can all benefit from.
Yeah. And do you think that this can really have the power to shape someone's perception of life or their perception of resilience?
So I believe that developing connection with your body, increasing that sense of safety, really helps us to let us know that even though we might be going through a really difficult time, we have the strength and the ability to influence and change our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and ultimately our perceptions. And I think that this really provides hope that we can tolerate discomfort, even though it can be very uncomfortable, but we can tolerate it and we can still be okay. And ultimately that we won't crumble. And if we do become a bit more distressed than we thought, we still will get up and, stand on our feet and have the resources and, do what we've done in the past if there's been a situation like that. And I really think that present focused, mindfulness-based strategies such as this helps to reduce our critical voice and helps to foster self-compassion, which is essential for resilience.
Amazing. And thank you for sharing a strategy with us that's not only easy to do, but really accessible as well. So you don't need any tools, you just need yourself. And I feel like it's so hard to find the motivation these days to help ourselves and, help better ourselves, because ultimately I feel like it's so much easier to just stay in a situation as opposed to try and, get ourselves out of it, do things to help ourselves. So having strategies like this makes this sort of much more easy to do, and we can see, something that can help us be better in the future.
Absolutely. And in line with that, that's why I really kind of go on about breath work and just coming back to your breath. And when I say breath work, it doesn't have to be a whole long, 30-minute exercise, but coming back to your breath and just slowing down even for 30 seconds and just noticing the shift in energy that can happen. And it's something that I suppose I'm speaking passionately about, because I notice for myself how much of a shift that can happen, even from feeling tired to doing 30 seconds of breath work, and I feel re-energized.
Yeah, amazing. And I feel like everything takes practice and everything takes some time to do. So even if you put aside some time to continuously do this, do you feel like that's when you might see the best results?
Yeah, I really think that with something like connecting with your body, coming back to the present moment, because of all the distractions in this world, I do believe that, a degree of commitment and discipline and structure around these practices is important. And of course, there can be days and times where you might forget or not have time to do it. But I guess it's that idea of, the 80-20. 80%, try and see if you can implement the practice. and that 20% of, I suppose not doing it and things coming up. But it's for me, I wouldn't say aiming for perfection and making sure you do it. It's okay, if I didn't do it yesterday, what got in the way? How can I actually try and manage that so that I don't get into that situation next time? So actually problem solving then.
Yeah, great. And thank you for sharing that with us. I'd love to jump into our last section for today, which is our open mic. So here, we're just going to give you a chance to talk about anything that you would like to. And there are no limits here. So yeah, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So I guess something that I see in my work with clients, and especially one of the main modalities I use with my clients, is schema therapy. And schema therapy is really about looking at how our underlying beliefs that we've developed in childhood in relation to our attachment figures have led to us taking on certain behaviors in life to cope, and essentially how these behaviors actually can cause us more distress and be more unhelpful than helpful. And part of schema therapy is really working with understanding core childhood needs that every child has. And when these needs are not met, and no parent is perfect, so everyone's going to have some needs that are not met at points in time. But when these needs aren't met, that's when we develop these schemas. So there's 18 maladaptive schemas. I'll just give you an example. Seeing as we were speaking about attachment and say anxiously attached individuals, abandonment is a schema. So that's the fear of rejection. So we develop these schemas because of these unmet needs. So what we try doing schema therapy, and generally the goal in adulthood, is to try and get these needs met by ourselves and even by others in our life now who are positive, positive people, positive, role models, or just significant relationships that we have. So understanding childhood needs is something I think is really important for any relationship, whether it be interpersonal, friendship, romantic, colleagues. And I just want you to go through the 5 core needs. So there's the secure attachment. So this comes back to having a childhood or just having that relationship that is safe, stable, nurturing, and one that's accepting of you. There's a need for autonomy and competence. So being allowed to do things that you want to do that are, appropriate. And this is in childhood, but also in adulthood. These needs are also present in our adult lives. The third one is freedom to express your own feelings and needs. And I'd say that this is one of the key challenges that come up for many people in their relationships. There's often an assumption that my partner should just know this. Yeah. So there's the assumption that they know my need. And or there's the difficulty to express your feelings because in childhood, when you maybe did express your feelings, it was dismissed and invalidated. So that's the third. The fourth need is realistic limits and self-control. So, we do need to have realistic limits and boundaries. And the fifth is spontaneity and play. And that's just about, self-expression, play, having fun, and experiencing that joy together with someone.
Great. And I feel like as you were talking, it's sort of made me realize the importance of educating yourself. And like we mentioned before, you mentioned that there's a lot of research you can do online and you can fall into a rabbit hole and you can come across some really complex things. But even just doing basic research, understanding the way you feel about things, the way you do things, why you act in certain ways, I feel like there is a reason behind everything. And even just doing a bit of research into something can really be enlightening and can help make sense of things. So thank you so much for bringing that to our attention as well.
Absolutely. And I really agree. When one actually has an idea of what they're wanting to research as well, so you can, specify it a bit more than just typing in like childhood trauma. But if you actually type in, core emotional needs of children, that's obviously more specific, and it would bring up information, and there's a lot of really helpful information. So something I really recommend to just get an understanding of, for your little child that might have not had some of those needs met, but actually they valid needs that you can meet and other people in your adult life can meet, even if they weren't met when you were younger.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think, is the perfect way to round off today's episode. Just, concluding with the fact that if you have something specific that you want to look into, like you said, don't just Google childhood trauma and find whatever you can find, but like have an idea of what you want or what you want to find out more about and then dive into that. I feel like sometimes being able to relate to something and feel like you're not just the only one who feels that way or acts that way can really help develop more compassion for yourself and who you are as well.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. You've really wrapped it up nicely in that last statement. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for joining us today. It was my absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a really lovely talk with you, and you've had some really amazing insights as well. And thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. And for everyone who's listening and they want to find out more about you, where can they go?
My website, which is www.clairehurtwitzpsychology.com.au, and you can find more about me. I have a blog, I've got my contact page, and if you ever want to get in touch, you know where to find me.
Perfect. Well, we've also got Claire's details down in the description below if you missed that. But thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time. You have been listening to Bouncing Back, the Personal Resilience Science Insights podcast produced by the Life Management Science Labs. Listen to episodes from LMSL's 10 Life Management Perspectives on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or other podcasting apps on your smartphone. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it and us grow to bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, pr.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Joanna. Thanks for tuning in.